So with the primaries coming up, we've had a lot of conversation about the primaries are coming up, but we've had a lot of conversation about the voting issues that have arisen, right? And I was reading an article, shout out to Hank. Hank shared an article earlier with all of us about North Dakota and some of the issues that native folks in North Dakota are having with being able to get to the polls because their tribal IDs do not fit the current ID requirement. And there's this whole big dispute about whether or not the law, North Dakota has a voting ID law, whether or not the voting law itself is discriminatory or disproportionately impacts to the extent that it's a problem for those, particularly those who are living on reservations. Because the argument is that, living on a reservation, there's not like there's a DMV site nearby or right on the res or anything like that. Like people, it's a long travel. It's similar. It's almost a similar argument to what happened in Alabama, right? When they closed down, an extent that, the DMVs that were available and open were really far away. I mean, it's cumbersome. And they're like, well, people, it's only $10. One of the points made in the article is like, for some families, $10 is like a couple of pounds of hamburger meat, some milk, some bread. Like $10 is a lot when you're already on a limited income. $10 is a lot. The response from the Secretary of State has been, well, you can get a free non-driver's license, a state ID, basically. But again, the issue is that people can't get to the DMVs to get a new ID, or they don't necessarily have the paperwork together that the DMV requires for you to get this new ID. So like the situation in Arizona we saw, right? Like what we've seen in North Carolina, Arizona, Wisconsin too. This is, I think in the past year, there have been 3 lawsuits from Native American groups around similar issues. And because again, why is all this stuff happening now? Oh my God, it's a conspiracy. Oh, no, not so much that it's a conspiracy, but this is the first major election since the Supreme Court allowed Section 5 to be nixed from the Voting Rights Act, right? This type of stuff would have been addressed under Section 5 review. And without Section 5, you have all these lawsuits, you have these different, they claim that it's a rational purpose, whatever, for having the voter ID law the way to do, but there's like no indication, there's no indication of actual voter fraud or anything that would warrant, the restrictiveness that's in place in North Dakota. But I really think we're talking about access, right? And we have Democrats who have traditionally been the ones that supposedly care about people having access to the right to vote, silent on these issues. And one of the things that was pointed out in this article was that for the folks in North Dakota, they're a very small population in the midst of a very strong Republican area. So most people, in terms of the presidential campaign, they're probably not even thinking about these folks as counting, right? But because of the growth of the populations in some of these reservation communities, voting age people, as well as the increased engagement and activity, there's actually, people can sway congressional districts, right? There's organizing stuff that's going around that can happen, and this can affect congressional races. Especially when we're looking towards 2020 with redistricting coming up. These are places, these are communities, these are people we want to make sure are actually voting, engaged, and involved. So, we get upset when things happen, but there is a real long-standing issue in terms of voter rights and access that's been going on for a very long time. But there is a renewed fight since Section 5 of the VRA was dismissed. It was ripped out. They took the little cutter and cut it out and threw it away. I mean, they gutted the VRA, they gutted the Voting Rights Act, and this notion, because there's a chart and it showed the counties, right? Counties that were over 50% American Indian, Native American, such counties had larger amount, it was more than 2 times. It's more like 4 or 5 times the amount of people who did not have the proper ID and were not eligible to vote. And, why don't, it's easy to say people should organize and this, that, and the other, But just because most people in the state are able to do something, when you overlook the special needs of particular groups and say, I don't really care what your issue is, we're going to do it anyway. You know, when you're disenfranchising people intentionally, whether it's a willful wanton disregard or you just don't give no chills, like it's still a problem that needs to be addressed. So it's going to be so looking forward to watching and how these lawsuits, you know, pan out going into November, if they'll be resolved by November, what's the case. But also communities have to start figuring out a way for themselves to have temporary fixes. And what does that look like? Well, that looks like getting a shuttle service, basically people shuttling people to go get their IDs and stuff ahead of time. We're going to have to start organizing and do our part to make sure that we can still get people to where we need to get them to, how we need to get them there, and just do what we can. Like it's not easy. It's not going to get any easier. Particularly if we don't get certain people in this year, right? 2016 is so important for so many reasons, and not just because Bernie Sanders is going to be our next president. Yeah, I said that.